And now I would like to introduce you to Gord Laco. Gord served on board the board of directors of Tall Ships America from 2015 to 2021, and currently sits on the board of Tall Ships Canada. He supports the operations of sail training ships and maintenance of classic yachts in every way he can. He began his career in the marine industry in 1979 after studying history at the University of Western Ontario, when he joined the staff of Toronto's Tom Taylor's company, following in the footsteps of his late uncle, Concostus. Gord has long held respect for seamanship and an appreciation for traditional rigging. He began importing gear for sail training and museum ships in 1999 when he was captain of HMS B. And some of you will remember that because we went and visited that ship. It's a reproduction gunboat schooner operated by the Ontario government on the Upper Great Lakes. He began distributing rope and rigging across North America on a full-time basis in 2003, after returning from 18 months as lead technical advisor to the production of the feature film Master and Commander, The Far Side of the World. He has served as historical advisor to over 60 film and television productions, recently working with Tom Hanks on the production of the World War II drama Greyhound. Gord was co-founder of Atlantic Challenge Canada. He served as executive director of the Toronto Brigantine and has sat on the boards of Huronia Museum and Midland Public Library. Even though, as a professional mariner, he dislikes shipwrecks, he also sits on the board of the Great Lakes Shipwreck Historical Society. Gord is a frequent public speaker on issues involving seamanship, nautical history, and youth development. He served 11 years as an officer of the Royal Canadian Navy and was, at the time of his commissioning, the oldest person to complete the RCN's Tough Basic Officers Training course. Core to his operations is his company, G.H. Laco and Son, which specializes in traditional gear for ships and yachts. He is proud that his son Robert has joined him in the business. When he has time, he races and cruises on the waters of Georgian Bay. This is the third time Gord has spoken to Shellbacks, but it has been 10 years since he has joined us as a speaker. So please give Gord a warm Shellback welcome.
Thank you, Diane. Hi, everybody. And thanks for the whole deal with the bio. I'm reminded of a time I was invited to speak at the Monroe County Museum south of Detroit in Michigan. The gentleman who introduced me gave a very thorough description, both of me and what I was going to talk about. And as I was sitting there listening, I did something that, or rather conspired to do something they tell you not to do when you're doing public speaking, and that is to try to crack a joke that you haven't planned carefully. They warned me before I got to the hall that Monroe, Michigan is where George Armstrong Custer grew up. So they said, don't make any jokes about Custer because they love him there. They think he's a hero. So after listening to my friend Matt introduce me, I stood up to the podium. I took a blank sheet of paper off my pad and crumpled it and said, thank you, Matt, for the very thorough introduction. You've told my whole story. There goes the first half of my talk. And I threw the paper on the floor. And then I said, and they warned me not to tell George Armstrong Custer jokes. So there goes the next part of my talk. And I crumpled another blank piece of paper and threw it on the floor. That time, everybody in the front row dove to see what the joke was. And they were horrified to find it was just a joke. It was a blank piece of paper. So with that beginning, what I'm going to do is what they taught me to do in the Navy when they're teaching officers to speak to ships companies. They tell you, tell them what you're going to tell them, and then tell them what you told them. Well, I'm not going to do it 3 times, but the format of this will be stories from my career, a bit about where I come from, a bit about where I've been, and a lot about some of the interesting yachts and ships that we work on. and then I'll throw it open for questions if anybody has any at the end. And I have to say, what I like particularly about talking to a crowd of sailors is the questions are usually the best part. So let fly when we get to the end. And I promise if I can't answer, I won't. And one time when I did a talk, the question that stumped me turned out to be from my sister. She's not here today, I can tell, so I think I'm safe. And by the way, Diane, I think I've spoken here probably 5 or 6 times. And
Well, I guess I only have a record of.
but anyway, I have a collection of pins, so that's how I know. I can have one on each blazer. At any rate, okay, so there'll be a bit of a fumble here while I go to screen to get the full screen to get my pictures up. I promise I'll make this as brief and painless as possible. Okay, I think you've got my screen there.
Yes, we do.
Okay, full speed ahead. Here we go. I like this picture because it basically encapsulates my whole professional life. The yacht that's sailing is my own surprise, and I named her for the vessel in Master and Commander, of course. And she's of a type that I remember when I first joined Shellback. I think I stood up and sang for the first time in 1981. And there was a type of sailing yacht that we were never supposed to mention in a meeting. Does anybody remember that embargo? If you don't, then you know that the Elberg 30 was never supposed to be mentioned at a Shellback luncheon. At any rate, that's what we sail. And not only is that my family on board there with my son, Pete and Red sitting up on the cabin top and me in my Tilly hat in the cockpit. That's our Epiphanes paint on the hull. Part of our business's endeavor is being the national importer for Canada for Epiphanes paint and varnish and so forth. And some of you may know that when I do talks at the January boat show, I always start holding up a can of our varnish, which is not cheap. And I always say the first person who pronounces our name correctly gets this can. I used to always get to keep the can because nobody said our name properly, but now I've done that gag so often, I'm going to disqualify you all by telling you that it's Epiphanes. So sorry, folks. And that's our varnish on the bowsprit there. And those are my blocks, and that's my rope on that on the rigging of that sailing ship that we were sailing into Midland with a few years ago, just before COVID. The vessel is Friends Goodwill. It's one of the vessels we did the complete rigging for and a fair bit of consulting trying to figure out how to make things work. Isn't Friends Goodwill a great name for a warship? Well, she started off as a fur cargo carrying vessel up near St. Joseph's Island in Michilimackinac. She was taken by the Americans and pressed into their fleet during the War of 1812. The interesting thing about her is she's what they called a sloop then, we'd call a cutter today. She's probably about 60 tons, so not small by our standards, but she's got a huge mainsail. And by the normal tables that we had for choosing block and halyard sizes, she kept bursting her blocks on the throat halyards. And one day, trying to keep my customer happy, I sat down and looked at the sail plans again and realized her mainsail is bigger than HMS Victory's. So rather than using scantlings and specifications for a 60-tonner, I did it for a 2,000-ton vessel. And she's got the blocks ever since, more than 15 years now, that we sent to replace the ones that were breaking. She's got a very powerful rig. I'm just realizing while I'm talking now, I don't have a picture of her here, but if you Google Friends Goodwill Michigan Maritime Museum, you'll get pictures of her. Reaching, she's damned fast. I was one of her officers. I was mate bringing her home to Michigan Maritime Museum on Lake Michigan after she was first built near Albany. And going up Lake Huron under short sail, we were still doing 10, 11 and a half knots in a not a strong breeze. And I commented to her operators at the museum that if they ever wanted to do a powerful publicity stunt, they'd enter her in the Chicago to Mackinac yacht race. And if they could figure out a rating for her, if it was a reaching year, they could win. She's fast. Not so good upwind, of course, and a bit awkward downwind with that goddamn giant mainsail. But reaching, she's an absolute rocket. So anyway, there's my whole business. Modern yachts with a traditional spin to them and classic sailing vessels. And if I can figure out how to make this thing advance. Oops, there we go. So that's me when I started in the marine business. I before before full time at Tom Taylor Company, I worked part time in my summers, working through university at MMOS, Marine Mail Order Supply. And so from about 1974 to when I graduated, I worked there at the Doncaster store in Thornhill, and then later the manager of the Pier 4 store, if anybody remembers that place from those golden days at the end of the 70s. Back in that time also, I'd already been a sailor for quite some time. I actually began my sailing career at RCYC, crewing for the Morton family in another Elberg 30. There, I've said it again. And I've commented often that I was probably difficult to deal with when I was a kid, because I thought I was a sailor before I was one. It's all I thought about. And interesting how kids are. My elder son, Pete, breathed and slept heavy equipment machinery since he was old enough to talk. And right now, today, he's working for the city of Ottawa, operating giant machines. And I watch him sometimes and think, that can't be my little boy who used to drive trucks around the borders of our Persian rug in our dining room. But yeah, that's what he does. So back in those years in the 70s, we used to go on albacore trips up in Georgian Bay. And I learned to love Georgian Bay, and that's why I live there now myself. The picture on the left is of one of our albacores. And yes, there were big waves sometimes up there in September. That's north of Point of Barrel somewhere, with giant waves rolling in. And what a remarkable sight that was to live through for a few days. The picture on the right is one of our sodden campsites. Traditionally, each of those trips would begin with all our gear getting soaked. And yes, that's a canvas tent we used back then. It weighed a ton when it was wet, and it was pretty miserable to sleep in. I don't know if you can see the people on my screen. The participants are covering it, but at any rate, people look dejected, and they certainly are. And I developed then a great hatred for camping, but I love the sailing. So I made a resolution then as a student that I would buy a keelboat with a cabin as soon as I possibly could pull the money together. So when I graduated, I joined Tom Taylor Company. They basically recruited me out of MMOS, the marine stores, and I was very proud to go down to Adelaide and Jarvis for the first time, to walk into Tom Taylor's and literally sit down at my late uncle Con Costas's desk in the rigging department. When he passed away when I was a boy in the earlier 70s, after a long illness, he left me his books and his models, some of which I have in my office here now. And I always jokingly blame him for me being destined to go into the marine business, but I don't think that's a bad thing. I've loved my career, and it's turned out well for me. The fellow on the right is Paul Schwartz, whose father was a friend of Tom Taylor's, and who bought the business from the Tom Taylor family when Tom himself passed away after World War II. That man taught me something that I never forgot in business. I remember one day back in the early 80s, he called me into his office, and he looked quite stern, which was surprising to me because we got along well. And he said to me, he said, "Gordon, you are an employee that I get more compliments about from our customers than anyone, but I'm also getting complaints about you from your co-workers." He said, "Because of the former, I'm going to give you 5 minutes of my time. Can you stay here and listen to me?" And of course I said yes. I was afraid I was going to be fired. And he said, he looked at me and he said very evenly, "Gordon, what does Tom Taylor Company exist for?" And I said proudly, "We're the finest yacht outfitting operation in North America, sir." And he said, "No," he said, "that's what we do. But what the company's for is to turn a profit for my family. And if we make enough money to keep the company going and to look after ourselves, I can afford to pay you what makes it worth your while to help us do that." Then he let that sink in for a minute. And then he said, "Gordon, how many times a year does your stock turn over in the rigging department?" And I said very proudly, 2.5 times. And he said, "That's correct." He said, "You'll be very surprised to know that the clothing department, 1/4 of the floor area of Tom Taylor Company, turns its stock over 5 times in a year. That is what's carrying this business just now. Don't be arrogant towards the people that work in the clothing department. Off you go." And I learned a lesson that day that I never forgot. that you can follow your passion into business, but business is still business. And I try to keep that in mind myself when I'm working on an interesting ship, and I really want to help them out by trimming the prices as far as I can. But it doesn't do them any good nor me if I go out of business. So I have to be a capitalist at some point. So thank you, Paul, for teaching me that lesson. So as I commented earlier at the beginning, I bought a keelboat as soon as I could possibly scrape the money together. I bought a 1947 vintage Danish folk boat that was at Ashbridges Bay Yacht Club. One of my customers had been rebuilding her over a few years, and to make a very long story short, Toronto Dominion Bank absolutely astonished me by loaning me every penny that I needed to buy the boat, because I was literally penniless at the time, just out of school. And we sailed that boat over the next 20 years, over 30,000 miles, which is around the world. But that was all on the Great Lakes. The picture on the right is of my new girlfriend from that year. That's Caroline. One of our early dates was scraping and painting the boat's bottom, and she married me regardless. And my host here remarked that he used to sail at Queen City Yacht Club, and I told him I'd add a slide in there from QCYC. When my folk boat first came to Canada, she was named Zani or Zane, and she sailed at Queen City Yacht Club before she went over to National. A fellow named Hugh Pendleton owned her, and there she is in a Tom Taylor Company ad from the early 1950s, which what we believe are the first suit of Dacron sails that Tom Taylor Company's sail loft ever made. And back in those days, the sailmaker was Joe Fernandez, who was a great friend of my uncle's, and who later, when Taylor stopped making sails, set up his own Triton Sails in Port Credit. And his son carries the business on today. And I'm also proud to say that I still buy all my sails from them. I've been loyal to them for, I guess, generations now, and they've looked after us for generations. Look at that Toronto skyline. There's not much there. And that was probably, I think, around 1952 or 53. The way I got this picture was I mentioned I had my folk boat for 20 years. I sold her in 1999 to buy the boat I have now. And I got her back about 10 years later and spent the next 8 years rebuilding her. I gave her to one of my customers in an 80% refinished state. But Wooden Boat magazine did a story about the rescue. And a lady in Connecticut wrote to me saying that that was her father in the picture. And I invited her to come sailing when the boat was finished, but she told me sadly she's too old to travel anymore, but she wanted me to have that picture. So I thanked her for it. I'm not sappy enough to believe that boats or ships have spirits themselves, but I do believe they accumulate the stories of the people that love them. And that's the spirit that they carry. And we need to remember those things so we can attach them. And I can tell you honestly, that boat was a good boat. And I always felt like she was like an extension of my arms and legs. And when I sold her, I wept. And when I found her again, I wept. And when I gave her away, when she was finished, because I really don't need two boats, I packed the container that she was shipped to BC in like an Egyptian tomb, stuffing everything I thought she'd need for her new life in. And again, some capitalist, I gave away way too much, but there we are. So as was mentioned in the introduction, in the mid-90s, I became executive director of Toronto Brigantine. More about that as a customer in a minute, but that's a much younger me in 1994 on the right, making a speech at the recommissioning of Pathfinder, the last time she was taken in hand and rebuilt. We tore her down over that year and a half to bare steel inside and out, and we did everything to her that everybody wished we could do. I recall calling together a dinner of every previous captain I could find and who would come. And while they ate the meal that I provided for them, I talked about what did you like and what did you didn't like about her. And we did things like improve her ballast. We changed her rigging somewhat. We changed the way her spars are made. And I think she came out of all that a pretty fine vessel. But that was a long time ago, and she's being taken in hand right now, even as we speak, but more about that later. So my career developed, and I went to work at Huronia Historical Parks around 1990-ish when we first moved here. And in connection with working in the marketing department for that historic site, the pair of historic sites, I began working as a consultant to film and television productions. By the end of the 1990s, I'd done about a dozen, including Canada, People's History, War of 1812, a feature film called The Crossing, The Real Moby Dick, and lots of other shows, including some pretty cheesy TV commercials that had boats in them. And in the midst of all that, I became one of HMSB's captains. And yes, that's the fearsome Captain Laco there on the right. That was great fun. We sailed her all over the Great Lakes, evangelizing Canadian history. But one day, I got a phone call from Richard Bailey, who was captain and manager and a good friend of mine, who lived and operated the 500-ton frigate replica HMS Rose. That's her on the right. And Richard called me up at my desk at Transat Marine in Barrie. I'd gone back into the private sector of the marine business by then, by 2001, selling what I call shiny marine gear, like Spinlock, Lumar, and so forth, all the stuff that normal people have on normal boats. And Richard told me that he had FedExed his rigging diagrams to me already. He wanted me to, quote, replacing all his running rigging fast. And he said the window of opportunity was short, but he wanted to buy it from me because he knew we had good rope. My employer at Transat had allowed me to start bringing in synthetic hemp rope for sailing vessels. And he said, you've got to move quickly on this. And I said, great, sure, I can do that. Thank you, Richard. I put the phone down, and then I sat there with my hand still on the handset. And I thought to myself, he can barely pay his phone bill most months. Where the blazes is he getting $120,000? I picked up the phone and called him back, and I said, who's doing a Patrick O'Brien film? And he said, I didn't tell you that. And I said, thank you very much. That's all I needed to know. And it took many months, but what transpired was that 20th Century Fox was shooting a film called Master and Commander, The Far Side of the World, about one of Patrick O'Brien's books. They had bought Rose to use as the hero ship in the story. And they did buy the rope from me. And to make that long story short, they hired me to stay on and work for more than a year as the lead technical advisor on the film. What a heady experience that was, but that's for another talk. So for a year and a half or so, we lived in movie land, shooting storm scenes and battle scenes and dining scenes and life aboard a ship scenes. And eventually that all came to an end. And I came home in November of 2002 and to restart my life up. Crow did the nicest thing in the world he could have for me, and that was invite me to travel with him to premieres all in various parts of the world. So it was he, myself, and the director, and sometimes some of the other actors doing media scrums. In other parts of the world, they wrote what I said about history and making the movie. But in Canada, the Globe and Mail did a full page feature about me in the entertainment section that fall. Basically, a local boy makes good story, and my name got around. My phone started ringing. I got an agent, and I literally threw my tie away and became what my wife called a free-range chicken. I decided that historic consulting in movies was just too flaky to bet the family's fortunes on. So I established a company that was the best part of what I loved about Tom Taylor's, and that was outfitting classic and traditional yachts and ships. This is one of my boat show displays. I tell friends that if what you're looking for is heavy and obsolete, that's my thing, which is pretty much the antithesis of what we did at Transat with modern shiny marine equipment, where lightness and speed and snazzy innovation is all the big thing. We specialize in doing things like they were. At boat shows, people would always come up to me with bushels full of old bronze equipment, as evidenced in the endurance wreck that was just discovered this week. The stuff lasts forever, and they would people would hope that I wanted to buy it from them, but we don't buy old gear. We sell new gear. And when they asked me what they should do with the old stuff, I'd laugh and say, well, float test it. And they wouldn't realize at first that I was joking, and I'm afraid I offended a couple of people by accident. But it's a funny thing. There is a quality in marine equipment that often doesn't exist anymore. And we live in that area where yachts are being outfitted whose owners and operators can afford quality. And that's where we go. I'll never sell 10,000 winches like Lumar does, but for me, 20 or 30 is pretty good. And if you want bronze winches that look like 1920, but have modern innards, well, we do that sort of thing. If you want blocks that look like John Alden originally specified in 1931, we can do that for you. We did all the rigging and deck layouts for the famous yacht Dorade that everybody knows what a Dorade box is. Well, there was a yacht named Dorade. And when she was rediscovered in Italy and rebuilt a number of years ago, we supplied all her rigging. And we went to great pains examining old photographs and so forth to try to recreate for her everything that she had. Sparkman and Stevens was wonderful about supplying us with original specification sheets. We had our block makers make the gear. Some of it is in that picture. And we're very pleased to say that when she came out again and raced, she re-won many of the races that she won when she first appeared. I believe it was 1932, or was it 29? Rob Mazza, maybe you know. I've forgotten. One of the cool things that happened through all that was Wooden Boat magazine, which has always been very good to me, published a story about the refit, and a gentleman came forward in the States who had stolen her tiller. Apparently, when she was going through one of her what we'll call modernizations in Italy, probably 30 years ago, and she was converted to wheel steering, he saw her in the yard and realized that they were throwing out her original tiller, the very one that the Stevens brothers had their hands on when she won the transatlantic race and others. So he stole it and he put it on the wall in his living room. And when he heard she was being rebuilt, he gave it back. Isn't that a wonderful thing? And now she has that tiller again. So another interesting project is the schooner HMS B. She's the one that I was captain of in the late 90s. And she's one of the two schooner gunboats that operate at Penetanguishene, which many of you have been to see. She's quite an interesting pickle as far as a sailing vessel goes. When I was her captain, we'd often have people who had starry eyes about naval history come up and ask me what she was like to sail. And if I sensed they were sailors asking the question, I try to tell them the truth. And basically that is, she sails well for an 1821 vintage schooner, but compared to a yacht, she's heartbreaking. And I'd point to the wake showing the 15 degrees of leeway if we were close reaching. And I found that offended people sometimes because all they wanted to hear about was how wonderful she was. And she is wonderful. And I changed my story after that, a few instances, to tell people she is wonderful, she's perfect, she's everything I would dream of in a schooner. And I did used to fantasize about owning her someday. But I said, I'm always careful never to ask things of her that I know she can't do. And since I'm talking to an audience of sailors, I'll say one of the things I know she can't do is point. She's pretty good to windward, but she's basically a big boat. There's no keel except for a bit sticking out underneath. She relies on her shape and that bit of cutwater and so forth for her grip in the water. And you're way, way better off to bear away and keep speed up than to try to jam her up into the wind. And we did used to have fun having visitors on board who were sailors or modern yacht sailors, and they'd sneer that we weren't pointing worth a damn, going back and forth in Severn Sound trying to get home or whatever. And I'd say, okay, you think you could do better? Carry on, mate, you've got the deck. So they'd crank in the headsails, they'd crank in that overlapping foresail and crank in the main. And yes, we'd drag her up to pretty much almost what a sloop would do, a modern sloop. And they'd look at me grinning and I'd say, lovely, now look at the wake. And we'd see we were making more leeway than anybody could dream possible. I used to, as a rule of thumb, stand beside the helmsman at the tiller and look through the leeward fore rigging, and that's the direction we were going. So that's probably about 10 or 12, sometimes more degrees of leeway. But you got to love them for what they are. She's a good little schooner. We took her all over the Great Lakes. Traditional vessels make rotten motorboats. Maybe I think I'll talk a little bit more about that later. But at present, right now, she's undergoing a comprehensive refit. She's indoors, and I'm delighted to say that we're supplying gear for her. And I've been asked for my expertise. And that is about the most pleasurable thing because we're doing things for her that we always wanted to do. And now that I don't work for the Ontario government anymore, nor have I for many, many years, I'll tell a story that I wouldn't have dared told then. One time we were leaving to sail down to the lower lakes doing port visits, and B had had a problem in with regards to a deck beam that whose cut off end was right where your forehead goes when you bend over the chart table down below. And everybody was smacking their foreheads on it. And I wanted to trim that corner off. But being the government, there was hoops to jump through that didn't happen fast enough for when we were leaving. So when the ship was leaving, one of the other captains, my good friend Richard, was doing the first leg of the trip. And there's the big casting off ceremony. All the brass were there from the government to watch her leave. Speeches were made, the lines were thrown, away she went. My friend reached down below the bulwarks and held up a saw, and he handed the saw to one of the seamen, who then darted down below to cut the corner off, and that's how that beam is still. And I remember the officialdom was absolutely horrified that we were doing this without a naval architect's say so. Rob, not that I have anything against naval architects, but this time I thought the caution was overly observed. And we used to get static sometimes from people complaining about us calling ourselves HMS for, of course, in her era, that was His Majesty's schooner. That schooner actually carries a royal warrant from the Royal Navy to call herself HMS. She and Tecumseh are the only two operable vessels outside the Royal Navy that have that honor. We used to get visited once a year by a captain who was the current naval attaché in Ottawa from the Royal Navy. And for him, it was a nice weekend with his family, but we treated it as a real inspection. And they were always very interesting people. And the finest compliment we got from one of them was a fellow named Captain Mackenzie. This would have been probably around 2000. And as he was leaving, he thanked me. And he said that he thought we had the real feel of a small warship. There was no bullying. There was no artificial look-see discipline on board, but everybody knew who was in charge and what the responsibilities were, and it was a well-oiled machine. And when he said that to me, I thought that's perfect. That's what we strive for, and I was very proud of our team for that compliment. So another interesting vessel on recently is a schooner called Alma, and Alma belongs to the San Francisco Maritime Museum, a pretty interesting operation in San Francisco Bay, right down on the waterfront. And they have a schooner that they operate on day programs there that is a scow. And to put it bluntly, Alma is very blunt. She's shaped like the lid of a shoebox, to quote her own captain, with a slight incline on the forward end. She's flat-bottomed, square-ended, and she sails like a witch. In this photograph, which I'm just seeing to my horror here, is not as sharply focused as I'd hoped when I saw it smaller. Sorry about that. That's Alcatraz Island behind her. She has a very large centerboard and a very large rudder. And with that rig and in the wind they have in San Francisco Bay, she is fast and weatherly. And what they wanted from us was a new rig and new sails. So I recruited my old friend, Andy Soper, who's built sails for many yachts and Toronto Brigantine's vessels for many years, operating out of Kingston. That's Andy on the right. And he built an absolutely crackerjack suit of sails for her, which Alma then went on to win the Mariners Regatta Cup the next year with. Good job, Andy, and what an interesting project that was. Another project that I've done relatively recently was another movie job. I got called one day from a person who wanted to buy synthetic hemp rope, and they wanted a lot of it. And of course, I innocently said, "What exactly are you doing with this rope?" And it turned out it was for a television series called American Gods. Well, American Gods is a sort of a science fiction fantasy, but there's Vikings in the first episode, and they wanted a Viking ship. So we ended up finishing the building of overseeing the finishing of a Viking ship that already started and got into a lot of trouble with, and we gave it a working rig. I have to say the thing was a pretty odd vessel, not safe to go more than a few feet offshore because of two motor welds they put in it. And Rob Mazza, imagine this, there I was at a table full of movie producers and movie people, all of them under terrible pressure, describing to me how they'd put motor wells in her for two 20 horsepower outboards. And I was explaining to them that, yes, she looks like she has freeboard, but the real freeboard is the 1.5 inches to the lips of the motor wells they put in her. She was open in the bottom for about 3 feet square, port and starboard of the keel, just forward of the steering station. So I convinced them to cap that over, and then they confessed to me that they had spent hundreds of thousands of dollars laying a steel cable track system on the seabed off Scarborough Bluffs, with hooks on the bottom of the ship that they hoped they could tow the ship back and forth on with invisible cables, so that it could be controlled easily and could go back to starting position quickly without delays. Well, of course, that's a landsman's solution to a pretty simple problem. And the issue they were suffering when I got there was the hull without its rig. Well, it was big. It's probably close to 70 feet long. And if the vessel was hooked onto the trolley system underwater, the trolley system of cables, and there was a ripple from a boat going by, the damn Viking ship just picked up the 2-ton concrete blocks, and they could never keep tension on the cables. So they had to keep stopping to restretch them. So I said to the production, guys, give me 2 days to train your men to row, and we'll just row it. You don't need all this stuff. So as it transpired, as usual with movies, they gave me 1 afternoon. And 2 of the Vikings are on the right there. The shorter fellow, which I hope you can see, because again, on mine, it's behind my stack of participants. It turned out he was an ex-sergeant in the Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry. They're a pretty tough bunch. And when I heard him mentioning that, I said, well, I was a naval officer. And he said to me, when we're out there rowing, he said, and if they were getting good at it, he said, if you find us getting giggly and not paying attention, you just let us have it the way you would have in the service. I said, okay. So we were out there shooting the film and doing the first run up on the beach for the film, and the director said, cut, okay, back to 1, let's proceed. And we turned going back out, and the rowing order I taught them for stopping the vessel basically is hold water. And at hold water, any rowing crew drops their blades in the water, holds the looms of the oars against their chests. Basically, it's like putting the parking brake on. Well, half of them did, half of them didn't. The Viking ship started slewing a bit, and it was such a barge. I knew if I lost control of it, I'd embarrass myself before I got her back into position. So I stood up from behind the actor that was portraying the helmsman, and I just let him have it like I would have when I was Lieutenant Laco in the Royal Canadian Navy. I said, hold water, so hold effing water. And they all looked at me stunned. All 14 oars, bang, went down in the water. And I heard the director, who'd seen a pretty mild Gord Laco before that, look at me and say, geez, Gord. And then I looked at my crew and said, all right, then, let's continue. And the ex-sergeant winked at me, so I guess that all worked out. Anyway, that was a very interesting project. There's a Viking ship in the first 7 minutes of American Gods. We worked on that thing for a long time, and boy, the cost that went into it, but that's movie making. And if anybody wants a Viking ship, actually, I heard they're looking for a home for it. Another interesting vessel we've had a lot to do with over the past 20 years is Pride of Baltimore 2. She's coming back into the Great Lakes this summer, so if you're interested in her, you can see her. She's probably one of the fastest and one of the best run historic vessels on the water today. Her captain, Jan Miles, is a crackerjack seaman, and in my lexicon, that means superb. They put more miles on her, I think, than almost any other vessel. She's been all over the Atlantic and Pacific. And one day, a while ago, I was driving in my car, actually on the way to a Tall Ships America board meeting, which was close enough I could get to in person. And my cell phone rang, and it was Jan Miles. And I knew that he was sailing in Europe somewhere, but there he was phoning me. And yes, he was in the Bay of Biscay, and he had just been dismasted. I mentioned that historic sailing vessels make rotten motorboats. Well, Pride of Baltimore was motor sailing at a pretty big head sea, trying to get into La Rochelle, France in time. And she was pitching heavily. And while sailing ships aren't designed to pitch, and with all that weight they have hanging off the ends, they can develop a terrible pitch. And what she'd done basically is broke her bobstay, and both sticks came down aft. In the picture on the right, you can see her in La Rochelle. And Jan told me that he was standing behind the helmsman, and the foremast and the mainmast came down port and starboard of him. He said if he'd had the presence of mind to move an inch, one of them would have crushed him. And I think you can see there how the main went right down, smashing through the bulwarks. Nobody got hurt. Nobody got hurt at all. But we had a frantic period of weeks gathering rigging and getting her going again, so she didn't miss her next port. And believe it or not, she didn't. That's a pretty well-run vessel, and you'll see her in Toronto and other ports this summer when she comes through the Great Lakes. Another vessel we're very proud to look after is HMCS Oriole, the old Gooderham family's yacht that was for the first half of her life based at RCYC. But since World War II has, I guess that's more than half, has belonged to the Royal Canadian Navy as a training vessel. She was a yacht until the war. They loaned her to the Navy for training, and after the war, sold her for a nominal amount of money. And she's been a training vessel ever since. I went through her when I was a junior officer. I can say she's powerful and absolutely exhilarating to sail. And being the person that supplies her blocks is a huge honor. And there's a photograph of some of them from one of her backstays on the right in that picture. She's, imagine a J-boat, I guess, from the 1920s America's Cup racing, but with a ketch rig. And that rig is shortened from what she had when she was younger. But when she's in the groove, she moves. And when I was aboard her as a junior officer, she was still in the Pacific. We were doing a Swiftsure race, and in the light airs at the beginning, the whole fleet stampeded by us. We had to anchor by race rocks to let the wait for the tide. But sometime during the night while I was off watch, the wind came back. And when I awoke, the first thing I noticed was the porthole by my bunk was underwater, and I was lying against the ship's side, not in my bunk. And I could feel this deep vibration in the vessel. She was sailing fast. And my watch tumbled into its gear, and we got up on deck, and I was the watch leader. So we took over, and I stood for a while beside the guy that was relinquishing the helm to me. And when I put my hands on the spokes, I can say honestly, I was absolutely speechless. We were doing over 12 knots, close reaching. And as the sun rose, we passed all the boats that had passed us the evening before. And rather than being disappointed at being crushed as they were in the race, they were cheering us. And we must have really looked something. If you want to see her, you'll see her in Toronto this summer. We're bringing her, and I say we because part of my portfolio is working on contract for the Royal Canadian Navy, looking after Oriole. We're bringing her to RCYC at the beginning of June for her 101st birthday. We're having a celebration for her there. And then I'm bringing her over to Harbourfront Center, where she'll be for most of a week for the public to see. So please come aboard. If you do, you'll probably see me. And she's quite something to see, and we're very proud of her. Interesting note, back in the 1970s, which were pretty dark days for the Canadian military with regards to budget cuts, we lost the other sail training vessel we had, which was HMCS Pickle. She was a German war prize, very similar in size to Oriole, but wooden with steel frames. She was sold out because the cost of maintaining her was deemed too great. But somehow we saved Oriole, and now everyone is glad we did. She's absolutely inspirational for the people who train aboard her, and she's launched many senior officers' careers when they were juniors just starting off in the Navy. And we're getting near the end here. Sorry, this is carrying on just a bit. Other vessels we serve are Blue Nose 2, St. Lawrence 2 down there in the middle, Fair Jean. And I'm very proud to say that Pathfinder, Toronto Brigantine's original vessel, is returning to service this season as a sail training ship. Being Toronto area sailors, most of you probably know that Toronto Brigantine came to the very difficult decision of selling her before COVID and using that money to clear debts and be able to look after Playfair, their other brigantine, properly. Well, last year, a very benevolent and generous patron came along. To make a long story short, he helped them buy Pathfinder back from the private owner. And the picture on the left is a shot I took of her in fairly dreadful condition in Kincardine, Ontario, where we were outfitting her to sail her back to Hamilton. The picture on the right is of Pathfinder this winter at Heddle Shipyards in Hamilton, where she is being torn down basically to bare steel inside and out, as just as I did back in the 90s for her. And she will be recommissioned on the 9th of June in Hamilton Harbor, where Briggs Inc. is based now. And I'm going to have Oriole there to stand by beside her. And boy, won't I be proud too, to see that my favorite ship of the two is returning back to service. And if you folks can come, I think you'd be welcome. So movies have continued. We mentioned Greyhound. I won't go into great detail there, except that's me with Stephen Graham, a very fine actor up in the top left, showing them how to use the plotting table to plot angles and interceptions. The actors learned very well, but the director thought they were being too careful. They wanted to see zip, 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 as if they'd done it 1,000 times, calculating interceptions. So in the movie, those are my hands that you see if you've seen Greyhound doing those calculations. And my most recent is an animated feature for Netflix. We originally was called Jacob and the Sea Beast. It's now just called The Sea Beast, and it's a fantasy. So imagine being a historic nautical consultant on a fantasy. There's sea monsters in it, so I can make stuff up if I need to, as long as it's got the right flavor, and that's been a lot of fun. Last picture. You very kindly mentioned at the top, Diane, that my son Robert has joined me in the business. It's now no longer G.H. Laco and Associates, it's G.H. Laco and Son. The picture on the left is my son Rob. To me, that was only just yesterday, but the picture on the right is him working in the business with that skid load of rope about to go to Blue Nose. And it's, I guess any of us who have owned family businesses, there's absolutely nothing finer than to have one of your kids show an interest and an aptitude in the business. And his desk is beside mine here right now, and although he's not here, and I'm looking forward to working with him. And that's the slideshow. So I'll go back to me on the screen. If you folks have questions or stories of your own, I'd be glad to field them through Diane.
But first of all, Gord, why was a certain vessel not supposed to be mentioned at Shellbacks?
I think because the Aalborg 30 Association developed such a following that people were pretending to be tired of hearing about those damn tubs. So a motion was passed not to mention the Aalborg 30 any longer. That was back in the early 80s.
Okay, thanks. Okay, first person to raise their hand is Gord Martin. Go ahead and meet yourself.
Okay, am I on?
Yep.
Yeah. Well, Graham, you just stole my question, because I've had an Aalborg 30 and a 31 or 37.
Oh, good.
And that was my question. Why wouldn't you talk about it? But they were certainly very popular in their day.
Well, maybe you and I should start talking about them so much that there's a revolt again.
Well, it's, I tell people I've had 4 sailboats in my sailing life. 2 of them scared the hell out of me, and the other 2 were Aalborgs.
Right on.
That's it exactly. They just are so damn stable. They're just incredible. And
okay,
so I love your stories, Gord, and hope to hear more.
Thank you. Actually, just because we're sailors here, I'll throw in something. Because we're all sailors, you may have empathy for this. Switching from the folk boat to the Aalborg was not easy for racing. And yes, believe it or not, I used to race the Aalborg, and or rather the folk boat in the Aalborg, and we do win sometimes, provided the sails are in good shape. The folk boat was so stiff, you could just push her harder and harder, and she'd just go faster. I used to know in racing that in winds over 12 knots, beating to windward, there wasn't much under 30 feet that we couldn't tackle, mostly because we could point so damn high. The Aalborg is different. They don't point particularly high, and they're tender for their weight, which is normally heavy and tender is not a great combination. But I had to change my sailing style completely. We reef earlier now. I don't bother trying to jam her up into the wind anymore. I try to keep the speed up. And we do occasionally still get people pissed off with us at regattas. There was one last year where A fellow in Collingwood complained about our rating. He didn't believe that he could have been beaten by an Elberg 30. But we did. And what I quoted to friends afterwards, not to him because I'm getting gentle in my old age, is in racing, I like to quote Genghis Khan's description of the best things in life. And my friend said, "Oh, what's that?" I said, "Well, he said, the best things in life are to defeat your enemies, ride his horses while listening to the lamenting of his women. For me, it's to beat them on real time, take the handicap and really grind them in, and then listen to the complaining about my rating."
Yep. Thanks very much. Next up, Tom, go ahead, unmute yourself.
Yes, thank you. I had a question about Blue Nose 2. When they refitted it, I believe it was almost impossible to sail because of all the regulations of the marine and architects, that they had to bring it up to today's standards. Is that still the case today, or has it been modified so they can really sail it?
No, they've been working very hard to modify to sail it. And that's an interesting story that one of them should probably tell. The people overseeing the refit were all very, very good, very experienced sailing ship operators and builders. But I guess how can I put this in a way that's both polite and on target? There were inappropriate regulations applied to her by people that weren't sailors in the government. And that led occasionally to modifications that had unintended consequences, like in her steering and so forth. They've been working diligently ever since to iron those out. And I think her captain would say that today she sails pretty sweetly again, but it was a long road, and one that on the Tall Ships Canada board, we watch very carefully. One of the things we're doing right now is working with Transport Canada to codify manning standards and best practices for operating sailing ships. It's not easy to do. I know from my time in the Royal Canadian Navy as an officer, to climb a mast to do something with an antenna without a 5-point harness on is completely impossible. In sailing ships, who do it all the time with a regular harness, and you're not clipped on when you're climbing. And the reason is, of course, in a sailing ship, you're climbing in a rig in an environment that's evolved over centuries to be a safe place for humans to work. Adding supposed safety stipulations to that can actually cause unintended problems that make it unsafe. So we're walking that tightrope right now, and with good cooperation from Transport Canada. They want to learn, and they want to do it right. But that's the sort of thing that can happen when any government agency begins taking a hand in something that requires a specific sphere of understanding, like seamanship does. I hope that answers your question.
Yes, it does. And thanks for getting things back to the original that worked.
Okay, again, the next one with their virtual hand raised, please, if you want any comments, please raise your virtual hand. Rob Massa, go ahead.
Hi, Rob.
Hey, Gord. Good presentation. Got a couple of questions, actually. One you just sort of touched on, which is the ability to create an accurate sailing ship replica nowadays. I did an article for Professional Boat Builder on John Scarano at Scarano Boatworks up in Albany, New York, who builds replicas. And he told me a story of,
yeah, sorry, go ahead.
He told me a story. A fellow came to him to build a replica of the America. And he said to the customer, well, I can give you an accurate replica above the waterline, but the Coast Guard's not going to accept below the waterline, or I can give you below the waterline, but you have to reduce the rig. And the owner opted for everything above the waterline, with the result that John hipped the boat to give it more stability, and which also gave him more room in the heads too, by the way. But he said it's almost impossible to get Coast Guard approval for a ship to carry passengers that is a true replica.
Well, the battle there is often stability. HMSB originally had boulders for ballast. We just can't tolerate that now. And she originally carried a 6-pounder cannon amidships, which weighs about a half a ton. We just can't tolerate that risk now. So she carries lead ballast externally to her keel, and her limit of positive stability is 110 degrees, which is damn good for a historic vessel. Tecumseh, her sister, was declared unseaworthy back in the late 90s when her LPS was deemed to be 74 degrees. That means if she heeled to 74 degrees, she'd keep going. And that's with lead ballast, albeit internal, but without two 24-pounder cannon on deck. We just don't take risks like they used to in the old days, and we don't need to anymore. And that's a topic that's a hot one. Interestingly, actually, can I just bring something else up here? This is a piece or sample of rope that I'm about to send off to a ship. This piece sticking out in the end here is Dyneema. The outside is Hmcs, which is a synthetic rope. And this is what we supply to historic ships for standing rigging. We don't supply wire rigging anymore. And on a large vessel, this is a small piece, but on a large vessel, we can save up to 2 tons of weight aloft by not using steel wire. And as historic ships strive to have acceptable, safe limits of positive stability, that's a very important thing. Interesting topic, eh?
Well, so was Steve Killing involved in the design of those replicas? I thought he was.
He was involved in the final part of the design of B. He took it over from an amateur, and he did not design Tecumseh. Steve is the fellow that we brought in to conduct our stability experiments, and it's his documents that we sailed under for the rest of the time that those vessels operated. So, yep, it was him.
And just the one last point, you mentioned the schooner scow Alma in San Francisco. When I was in New Zealand, I think it was, I went to the Maritime Museum in New Zealand, in Auckland, and they have a sailing scow that's available, that they take out museum visitors on and cruise around the harbor. And I was shocked when I got to San Francisco and saw almost exactly the same vessel in Alma sitting in San Francisco. And the popularity of those scows as basically transport trucks of the 18th or 19th century was just amazing. They were built everywhere and built cheaply, and were just discarded when they rotted out. They're just amazing vessels.
Well, and an interesting thing about her, about Alma, is that I've seen her stability book, and she's basically like a catamaran. She's stiff as hell until she heels over, and then she's not stiff at all. Yeah. So they sail her very carefully, and she's in a special category that the American Coast Guard will tolerate for them. But a big part of her safety is that she doesn't have a keel; she has a centerboard. So in heavy air, they pull the board up some, and she skids, and they sail her that way.
Thanks, Gord.
Okay, next up in line with their virtual hand is Noel. Go ahead.
Hello, Noel.
Yeah, hi. Just a couple of things. We were sailing out of Penetang, late 80s, early 90s, I guess, and in the fog, heavy, thick fog, and we could hear the bee coming up behind us. Couldn't see it, didn't know what it was, but we could hear the creaking and the groaning and voices. And then it popped out of the fog about 20 feet off our side and went sailing by. It was like being in a time warp back to the 18th century. And the Allberg thing was Shellback, started with Bob Townsend.
Right.
He wouldn't shut up about them. So we instituted a fine. So every time the word was mentioned, I think it started at 50 cents, went into the dory, and it wound up at $1. Right. Going in there. And with the folk boats, I can remember when the folk boat at the boat show was the big boat that everybody went on down to sea and lined up for. So.
Isn't that funny? Funny thing about B, when we had the ballast moved externally during my time as her captain, which I fought for hard, and I'm glad we did it. But a funny thing developed in her. When she's sailing fast, if you look over her stern from her quarterdeck, you can see a ribbon of cavitation coming off the tip of her rudder, and that didn't happen before. And I guess it's some anomaly of turbulence down there, but we used to call it towing the ghost. And if you were towing the ghost, you were really cooking.
Yeah, good.
Okay, anybody else have any questions or comments? Please raise your virtual hand.
Okay.
Well, I guess
Well,
I've
I
either
think-
exhausted you or satisfied you.
Peter, I think you're raising your hand. We can't really tell if you can't raise your virtual hand. Appreciate it in future if you could raise your virtual hand. But go ahead.
Hey, Gord, I have
Hi.
a couple of questions about a couple of tall ships that I've worked with, one of which you turned me on to. And so the first one is the Earl of Pembroke in England, which I used in Treasure Island as his. And I know that's a very well-known tall ship. I wondered if you could update me on what's happened to it. And the other one is the ship in Kingston, which I used it, and I think it was you who told me about it. That was 10 years ago. And I used that for this film, Shipwrecked on the Great Lake. I think it was called the Fair View or something.
Fair Jean.
Fair Jean.
Yeah.
Are both those ships still around?
Yes, Fair Jean is still going strong. Actually, she's one of the particularly well-run Canadian vessels. Peter, I couldn't make out the name of the ship in England. What, could you say that name again?
The Earl of Pembroke.
Oh, yes, I know of her. I don't know anything about her. I'm afraid. Sorry.
You do know the ship, though.
I do know the ship, but I have no connection with her. I don't know any news.
It's interesting. It's kept in a locked harbor, so it's permanently wet with one of the few locked harbors in Great Britain.
Okay. Next up with a virtual hand, go ahead, Jim. Unmute yourself.
Hi, it's a wonderful talk. I was wondering if Gordon could give Diane the list of dates and places the historic ships would be in Toronto.
Mhm.
Yes, I can do that. I'll email that after the talk.
Thank you very much. Keep up the good work. Sail on.
Okay, next up is Janice. Go ahead.
Hi there. Gord, I have a question related to my interest and the interest of a group here in Port Credit to undertake the building of a replica of a stonehooker vessel. We're really just at the beginning of sort of scratching that possibility. Would you be able to help us figure out the cost of doing that?
Yes,
or could you recommend someone?
Well, that's the sort of thing we do on the consulting side for museums and groups.
Great.
I usually start off by reminding people that back in the days of sail, operators and even the military used to budget spending the cost of building a ship again every 12 years in order to maintain it.
Oh boy.
It's yes, that ratio is still true today. And where ships get into trouble is they get the ship built and then they're overwhelmed by the costs that follow. One group that certainly did not do that was Michigan Maritime Museum. John Scarano built them, Friends Goodwill, and they had a very sound business plan, and they had a schedule for refits before the ship was even built. And they made that part of their planning and fundraising to the point where they realized that if they took a mortgage on her and built her 2 years sooner than the rate of fundraising would have realized if they paid cash, by getting her in service 2 years earlier and starting to earn money, it worked, and it did. So what I could do maybe is put you in touch with them. And if it was appropriate afterwards too, I could help you folks figure out what the real costs are of running a ship. But Jim Spur is the head of the group that built Friends Goodwill, and I think they're a particularly competent group with regards to being able to face the real costs and keep their ship like new every year, which of course is important for safety as well as anything else.
Sure.
So
Thank you.
Janice, would you like me then to email Gord with your and copy you so that you've got a connection then?
Yes, please.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, okay. Next up with their virtual hand is Noel. Go ahead.
No?
Noel?
Yep, there it goes. Button didn't work. Just as an aside, I was looking this morning and they found Shackleton's Endeavour
Yes.
at the bottom of the Antarctic Ocean. If nobody's looked on the news or anything, it's there with some phenomenal pictures of it sitting on the bottom. So,
Hey, David Weatherston, I thought for sure you'd have a hard question for me.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Next up is Rob Massa. Go ahead, Rob. I think you need to unmute yourself.
There we go. Just a follow-up observation to the concept of building a replica stone hooker in Port Credit. The most famous stone hooker in the world on the lakes was White Wings, Amelius Jarvis's White Wings. And White Wings actually was used as the foundation for a breakwater at Port Credit Yacht Club in the 1920s, I think, when Jerry Snyder finally gave her up. And White Wings, of course, was the boat that Amelius Jarvis rose to fame with when he was in Hamilton. And so if you're looking to build a stone hooker, I'd take a close look at White Wings because her lines are available. You know, and we just had a model built of White Wings at the Royal Hamilton Yacht Club.
Oh, excellent. Hey, can I tell a stone hooker story, Diane?
Yes, go for it.
When I was still in the Navy, I was based at HMCS York, and one day a gentleman came in who had some fame because in the 1970s, he'd, as a diver, had found the wreck of the Sligo, a stone hooker that had sunk off what is now Ontario Place, in not quite in Humber Bay. He found her wreck is still there on the bottom in relatively shallow water. So, but the reason he came in one day after arranging an appointment was when he was a seaman in the Navy himself at the end of World War II. He was part of the parade at HMCS York, which was then at the CNE grounds, when the ceremony marking the end of World War II was held. And when the white ensign came down the flagpole at the end of the ceremony, he was the signaler that was detailed to go and pick up the flag and take it back. Well, he was 17 or 18 years old, right at the end of the war, and he realized, God damn it, this is history. That's how he told it to me. And he stole the flag. And he kept it in a box until about 10 years ago when I was still in the Navy. And he called us up and said he had this. Did we want it? Of course, we said yes. So when he arrived at the door of HMCS York, as soon as we got him in, we put him under arrest for stealing the Queen's property. And he was quite elderly. And his daughter was there supporting him at his elbow, helping him carry the box with the flag in it. I thought for a second that we'd killed the poor guy. He was so horrified because we had seamen with rifles and everything ready to march him away, and we had to relieve him of doubt that no, it was just a joke. But that flag is now in the parade deck at HMCS York, and I had a plaque made thanking him for what he'd done.
Yes, the flag might not have survived otherwise if you hadn't.
No,
had
it's really good. No.
Okay, one last call for anybody who want a question or comments to raise their virtual hand before I turn it back to Diane.
I don't know how to do the virtual hand. I missed that instruction. So perhaps you could consider this my non-virtual hand going up.
Oh, hi, David.
I have a simple comment, which is that I just don't know enough about your field to stump you with a tough question. So I'm not even going to try. But it has been an interesting presentation. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, David. Well, my sister didn't either, but I forget what her question was, but she nailed me.
By the way, I will mention in passing, since everybody's talking about the safety of sailing replicas and so on, there's a series of books called the Book of Ships or something like that, done by the Greenwich Maritime Museum. Fascinating little books. they look like little kids' books, but they are really wonderful. And in closing, the not curator, whatever, the head of the Maritime Museum added that according to some research he and his people had done, the sailing ship was per miles traveled, and including every form of transportation known that they could figure out, including the space shuttle. Sailing ships were the most dangerous method of transport ever devised. So take that for what it's worth.
Well,
You're the people who are worried about
I do tell boards of directors when we're talking about things like that, about rigging modifications and so forth, that we don't take coming home without a few of our people with the same good humor they used to. We just can't do that anymore.
Okay. One last.
David, just before you anybody else goes on, what was the name of the Maritime Museum where you had those little books?
It's the Greenwich Maritime Museum in Greenwich, England.
That's the big one.
It's the big one. It's zero.
Yes, zero.
Runs right through the center.
It's the National Maritime
It did run
Museum.
right through the center. The U.S. Navy keeps changing the algorithm for the for GPS, and apparently the line moves a couple of feet every now and again. They decide they're going to do a little update here, there, and everywhere. And so there's this plate on the observing platform that says where zero is. The docent who I was talking to was, well, it's here, now it was here, and that's here.
Okay.
Okay.
Navy.
One last comment from Ron or question before I turn it back to Diane.
Yeah, just a quick comment. The diver who discovered the Sligo and recovered the flag was Don McIntyre.
That's right. That's him.
Yeah, member at National Yacht Club. He did a lot of diving in our basin, securing moorings as well.
Nice guy.
Okay, so now I'll turn it back over to Diane.
Gord, thank you. That was absolutely fascinating. I've learned so much today because I knew nothing about the old ships and the rigging, although we did visit the Bee, and I would love to see her out sailing. It would be marvelous. You were lucky, Noel, to have it come up alongside you like that. I do have one question, Gord. To whom did you give away your, the faux quote?
I gave her to Mark Jacobson, who owns Hillmark Boats near Courtney, BC. He's one of my clients and a good man, and I knew I couldn't bear to sell her to a stranger again. And partially finished, she wouldn't sell for much, and I didn't want her to go to somebody who bought her just because she was cheap. So Mark paid for the shipping, and I gave him the boat, and she'll live on, and that's what I wanted.
And you knew that he would love her.
Yes.
Yes, exactly. Well, thank you so much for being here. As I was listening to you, I was thinking, well, maybe we should have you back again for another talk or two next year, if you're up for that.
Sure.
I'm thinking of the Master and Commander. I think you might have done it before.
Yes,
there are many of us who haven't heard the tale. So I shall be in touch, and because you've got so many pins, I'm not going to send you a pin, but I will send you a little certificate saying thank you.
Well, that's fair. Actually, Diane, you don't need to. And I don't mean to be ungrateful, but what I usually ask my hosts is that they make a donation or do something for Pathfinder and Playfair. And
well, actually, we do that every year. We do donate to
Okay.
Pathfinder. As you know, that our all those donations we get are the $20 fee that we have. Anything we have left over, we give away.
Thank you.
So Pathfinder is certainly part of that.
I remember back in '94, Shellback and Spring Thaw were both huge supporters. We couldn't have done it without you folks.
Yes, exactly. And I look forward to getting those dates about the ships that are going to be in Toronto and exactly where they will be. And
Yep.
also you mentioned something that's going to happen in Hamilton. I don't remember exact on
The
June 9th.
recommissioning of Pathfinder.
Okay, so recommissioning of Pathfinder, just put that date in there as well, and I will certainly share it with people. I know I'm certainly going to try and get out there on the 9th of June. I think that would be absolutely amazing.
Thank you, Diane.
So big round of applause for Gord. That was just wonderful. Gord. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you, friends.
And coming up next week, we're going to have a video on Roald Amundson's expedition with Koa that was first to navigate the Northwest Passage north of Canadian mainland on one expedition and one ship. And it was in 1903 to 1906. So we'll look forward to that. We've got actually two videos, one from the From Museum in Oslo and one from the Vancouver Museum. And I'd like to thank Victor Weger for recommending these to me. Noel Leon will also be showing us 2 5-minute videos of the grounding of the DS Olaf Berg in March of 1941 on the beach at Ocean City, Maryland. And they show the last rescue using a breeches buoy on the east coast of the US. And this is significant because Noel's father was aboard that ship. So
Wow.
that should be interesting. And then on March 23rd, and I'd like to thank Julia Morton-Marr for this, we're going to see the Navigators, Pathfinders of the Pacific. And that's one of the first and best documentaries produced about the life of Grandmaster Navigator Mao, and I'm not sure I'm going to say this name correctly, Piaulug, or Papa Mao, and the Micronesian people, and they've preserved the nearly lost art of navigation with stones. And so that should be fascinating. I have not watched it. Julia has watched it and considers it excellent. A ship that has come out of this particular method of doing this is the Hokulea. And the following week, we'll have a little bit about the Hokulea. It's a training ship akin to Pathfinder and Playfair, but they're using the same methods that are used in the Navigators. So with that, pipes out, everybody.